The first light of dawn broke cold and gray over the Idaho foothills, painting the valley in shades of iron and ash. Jake Sullivan stood at the edge of his pasture, coffee steaming in his calloused hands, surveying land that had belonged to his family for 3 generations and might not survive a 4th. The fence line sagged in places where he couldn't afford proper posts. The barn needed a roof he didn't have money to replace. His small herd of cattle grazed on grass grown thin from overuse and drought. At 42, Jake looked older. His face was weathered from sun and worry, lines carved deep around eyes that had seen too many lean years stacked end to end. His truck was held together with prayers and duct tape. His boots had been resoled twice. The bank sent letters he couldn't bring himself to open, each one a countdown to foreclosure he tried not to think about. But the animals were fed. Always fed. Even when it meant Jake went without, even when it meant buying feed on credit he couldn't repay, the cattle and the aging horses got their portions. That was the Sullivan way. You cared for what depended on you, no matter the cost. The sound came as he was turning back toward the house. Faint, almost lost in the morning wind that rattled through the cottonwood trees. A cry that made his chest tighten with recognition and dread. An animal in distress, in pain. Jake set down his coffee and moved toward the sound, his stride quickening as the cry came again, louder now, desperate. It led him to the property line he shared with Roy Brennan, the boundary marked by old barbed wire strung between posts that had stood since Jake's grandfather's time. And there, tangled in that wire, was a filly. She was small, maybe 6 months old, her coat a deep bay that was matted with blood and dirt. The barbed wire had wrapped around her legs, her neck, her chest. Everywhere she'd struggled to free herself, the wire had cut deeper. Blood stained her coat and the ground beneath her. Her eyes rolled white with terror and exhaustion, her breathing coming in harsh gasps that spoke of hours spent fighting for freedom that wouldn't come. Jake recognized her immediately, one of Roy Brennan's horses, from the herd Roy kept on the 1,000-acre spread that bordered Jake's modest 200 acres. Roy, who bred expensive horses he treated like commodities, who viewed animals as investments rather than living creatures, who had a reputation that made decent people look away and kept the sheriff's office busy with complaints they rarely acted on because Roy had money and influence and friends in places that mattered. The filly's eyes found Jake's, and in them he saw something that bypassed thought and struck straight at his core. Pleading, raw and desperate and fading. "Easy now," Jake murmured, approaching slowly despite the urgency screaming through his veins. "Easy, girl, I'm going to help you." He assessed the situation with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent his life around animals. The wire was embedded deep in several places, twisted around her legs in ways that would require careful cutting to avoid severing veins or causing more damage. She was weakening, going into shock. If he didn't work fast and smart, she'd die right here in the dirt. Jake ran back to his truck for wire cutters, gloves, and the first aid kit he kept for the cattle. His hand shook as he gathered supplies, adrenaline and fear making his movements jerky. He'd seen horses die from wire injuries, had watched them bleed out despite desperate attempts to save them. This filly was small and already severely weakened. Her chances weren't good, but he had to try. The cutting took 20 minutes that felt like hours. Each snip of wire had to be calculated, positioned to release pressure without tearing already damaged flesh. The filly struggled occasionally, pain and panic overriding the exhaustion that had nearly claimed her. Jake talked to her continuously, his voice low and steady, promising things he wasn't sure he could deliver but needing her to hear kindness while she suffered. When the last wire fell away, the filly collapsed completely, too weak to stand. Jake wrapped her wounds with gauze and tape, his hands gentle despite their roughness. Then he did something that would have made younger men laugh. He sat down in the dirt beside her, placed one hand on her neck, and just stayed, breathing with her, being present in her fear and pain because sometimes that was all you could offer, and sometimes it was everything. "You're going to be okay," he told her, and chose to believe it was true. "I've got you now. You're safe." The sun climbed higher, burning away the gray dawn, and Jake Sullivan sat in the dirt at the boundary of his failing ranch, his hand on a dying filly who belonged to the man who'd made his life harder at every opportunity and made a decision that would change everything. He was taking her home, and he wasn't giving her back. Jake's barn was small but clean. The stalls mucked daily even when he had only 2 aging horses to occupy them. He converted one into a recovery pen for the filly, laying down fresh straw, filling a water bucket, and mixing a mash of grain softened with warm water that might be gentle enough for her traumatized system. Getting her to the barn had required his truck, a makeshift sling and strength he didn't know he still possessed after weeks of skipped meals. But she was there now, lying in clean straw, her wounds cleaned and properly bandaged with supplies he'd gotten from Doc Vance, the veterinarian in Crowley Springs who'd agreed to come out despite knowing Jake's credit was stretched to breaking. Doc Vance was a woman in her 60s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, who'd been treating animals in this valley for 40 years. She examined the filly with gentle efficiency, her expression growing darker as she catalogued injuries. "Wire wounds are deep," she said finally. "Got infection, starting in this hind leg. She's dehydrated, malnourished beyond what a few hours stuck in wire would cause. This horse has been neglected for weeks, maybe longer." She looked at Jake directly. "This is Roy Brennan's filly, isn't it?" "Yes, ma'am." "You planning to give her back?" Jake's jaw tightened. "No, ma'am." Doc Vance studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "Good. I'll send my bill whenever you can pay it. Meanwhile, she needs antibiotics, pain medication, and careful monitoring. Keep the wounds clean, change the bandages twice daily, and call me if her condition worsens. She's got a fighting chance if we're diligent." "I'll be diligent." "I know you will." Doc Vance packed her supplies. "Jake, Roy's going to come for her, and when he does, this valley's going to have opinions. Loud ones, you ready for that?" "No," Jake admitted, "but I'm doing it anyway." Roy Brennan came 2 days later, his black Mercedes kicking up dust as it roared down Jake's drive. He emerged from the car like he owned the air itself, tall, silver-haired, wearing clothes that cost more than Jake's monthly income. His face was red with fury barely controlled. "Sullivan," Roy's voice carried across the yard. "Where's my horse?" Jake had been expecting this, had been dreading it. He stepped out of the barn, closing the door behind him, putting himself between Roy and the filly. "She's being cared for. That's theft. That's my property you're holding." Roy's hands clenched into fists. "I want her loaded and returned immediately." "No." The word hung between them, simple and absolute. Roy's face went from red to purple. "You can't refuse. That filly's worth $20,000. Her bloodline didn't stop you from leaving her to die tangled in wire," Jake said quietly. "Didn't stop you from starving her or neglecting basic care. I've got a vet's documentation of her condition. She wasn't just hurt by the wire. She was already suffering. That's a lie. My horses receive excellent care. Then you won't mind if Animal Services inspects your property. It was a bluff. Jake had no authority to call for inspections, but the way Roy's eyes narrowed told him the threat had landed. You're making a mistake, Sullivan, a costly one. I'll have my lawyers contact you by end of business today, and when I'm done, you won't have a ranch to return to. Roy turned back to his Mercedes. Keep the horse for now, but you'll pay for her, one way or another. The town of Crowley Springs had fewer than 3,000 residents, most of whom had lived there for generations. News traveled fast, carried on phone calls and over coffee at the diner, spreading like wildfire through a community already primed for division. By the end of the week, everyone had chosen a side. Team Justice formed around Doc Vance, who'd made her position clear at the town council meeting. Jake Sullivan rescued an animal from neglect and abuse. Roy Brennan should be investigated, not defended. She was joined by Anna Hartley, the high school teacher who'd grown up hearing stories about Roy's cruelty to animals, and by the handful of animal rescue volunteers who'd been trying for years to build a case against Roy's breeding operation. Team Law rallied behind Sheriff Mills and Mayor Thompson, both of whom insisted that property rights were sacred and couldn't be violated regardless of moral concerns. We don't live in a vigilante society, the mayor declared. If Jake believed the animal was mistreated, he should have reported it through proper channels, not stolen valuable property. The division cut through families, churches, businesses. The diner put up a donation jar for Jake's legal defense, which the mayor publicly denounced. The feed store owner, who supplied both Jake and Roy, tried to remain neutral and lost business from both sides. Sunday services became battlegrounds of passive-aggressive prayers and pointed sermons. Jake's daughter, Rebecca, bore the worst of it at school. 17 years old and trying to navigate her senior year, she found herself ostracized by classmates whose parents supported Roy, targeted by whispers and social media posts that branded her father a thief. She came home one afternoon with red eyes that told Jake she'd been crying. "It's getting bad," she said quietly. "Really bad." Jake pulled her into a hug, feeling the weight of his choices pressing down on both of them. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. If I'd known it would hit you like this—" "I'm not asking you to give her back," Rebecca interrupted. "I saw her, Dad. I saw what they did to her. I just wish people could see it, too." But people saw what they wanted to see, or what they feared to look away from. The legal proceedings began with papers served at dawn, Roy's lawyers moving with efficiency that spoke of money and experience. The suit demanded return of property valued at $20,000 plus additional damages for lost breeding opportunities, veterinary costs, and emotional distress. The total sought was $75,000, more than Jake's entire ranch was worth. His lawyer, a young man named David Chen, who'd just opened practice in Crowley Springs, looked pale as he reviewed the filing. "They're going for everything. If they win, you lose the ranch. Probably file for bankruptcy. And they've got a strong case because, legally, you did take property that wasn't yours. So what's our defense? Animal cruelty, abandonment. We argue you had moral and ethical obligation to intervene." David didn't sound confident. Problem is, proving systematic abuse is hard without prior reports or documentation. And Roy's lawyers will argue the wire injuries were accidental, that any malnutrition was temporary oversight, that his operation has passed every official inspection. "Because the inspectors are his friends," Jake said bitterly, can't prove that in court. The preliminary hearing was held in the county courthouse, brick building that had stood since the 1920s and smelled of old wood and older secrets. Jacob sat at the defense table, painfully aware of his worn clothes next to Roy's expensive suit. His court-appointed lawyer beside Roy's team of 3 attorneys whose hourly rates could have fed Jake's cattle for months. Judge Henderson presided, a severe woman in her 50s who'd built a reputation for strict adherence to law over sentiment. She listened as Roy's lead attorney laid out the case. Valuable property stolen, financial damages mounting, precedent that must be maintained. Then David stood to present Jake's defense, and Jake felt the fragile hope he'd been clutching begin to crack. "Your Honor, my client acted out of moral obligation to prevent further suffering to an animal in distress. The filly was severely wounded, malnourished, and abandoned on Mr. Sullivan's property line. He provided necessary emergency care." "The horse was not abandoned," Roy's attorney interrupted. "It escaped through a damaged fence section. Mr. Brennan was actively searching for the animal when Mr. Sullivan took it. After it had been trapped for hours, possibly days, in barbed wire that Mr. Brennan's fencing failed to maintain." Speculation. The timeline cannot be definitively established. Judge Henderson raised a hand for silence. "Mr. Chen, do you have documented evidence of systematic abuse or neglect at Mr. Brennan's facility?" David hesitated. "We have veterinary records documenting the filly's condition when she was brought to my client's property. That documents her condition at one point in time, not a pattern of abuse. Mr. Brennan's attorney has submitted inspection reports showing his operation meets all legal standards." The judge's expression was unreadable. "I'm ordering a continuation to allow both sides to gather additional evidence. Mr. Sullivan, you will maintain custody of the animal pending final judgment, but you are financially responsible for all costs associated with her care." Court adjourned. It was a temporary victory that felt like slow defeat. Jake had the filly, but the case was far from over, and every day brought new costs he couldn't afford. The town's division deepened, became uglier. Anonymous notes appeared in Jake's mailbox, some supportive, others threatening. Someone spray-painted "thief" on his barn wall. Rebecca came home crying after finding hateful messages posted about her online. Local businesses Jake had worked with for years suddenly had scheduling conflicts when he needed services. But there were also moments of unexpected grace. Anna Hartley started a crowdfunding campaign for his legal fees. Doc Vance provided veterinary care at cost. Neighbors Jake barely knew showed up with donated hay and feed. The division was real, but so was the solidarity on his side of it. Still, the pressure mounted. The bank sent foreclosure warnings. The stress carved new lines in Jake's face. He lost weight he didn't have to lose. Sleep became something he chased but rarely caught. And through it all, the filly healed. Slowly, painfully, but undeniably. Her wounds closed. Her coat began to shine. She started eating reliably, putting on weight, moving with less obvious pain. Jake named her Hope, because that's what she represented. The stubborn belief that doing right mattered even when it cost everything. One night, as he sat in the barn watching Hope sleep, Rebecca found him there. "Dad," she settled beside him on the hay bale. "Are we going to lose the ranch?" Jake wanted to lie, wanted to promise everything would be fine, but Rebecca deserved honesty. "Maybe," he said quietly. "Probably. The legal fees alone are going to bury us, and if the judge rules against us, we lose everything." Was it worth it? Jake looked at Hope. at the living, breathing result of his choice and found his answer came easier than he expected. "Yes," he said, "even if we lose everything else, she's alive because I didn't look away. That's worth something. That has to be worth something." Rebecca leaned her head against his shoulder. "I think so, too." The discovery came during routine depositions when David was reviewing financial documents Roy had been ordered to provide. As a young lawyer still learning his craft, David had the advantage of meticulousness born from insecurity. He checked everything twice, cross-referenced obsessively, looked for patterns others might miss. And he found one. "Jake, look at this." David spread papers across the kitchen table, excitement making his hands shake. "Roy claims the filly's worth $20,000 based on her bloodline and breeding potential. But his tax records show her insured for only $5,000. And look here." He pointed to another document. "He bought her dam for $3,000 2 years ago. Claimed the mare as a business loss when she died giving birth. If the mother was worth $3,000 and the filly's insurance is $5,000, how does he justify claiming $20,000 in damages?" Jake studied the numbers, not fully understanding, but sensing David's excitement was justified. Could just be he insured her lower to save on premiums. Maybe, but then there's this. David pulled out another file. His breeding operation shows consistent losses for 5 years. Yet he keeps buying horses, expensive ones, and claiming they're for breeding. But there's no record of successful foals sold, no stud fees collected, nothing that would make this operation profitable. So where's the money coming from, and where are all these horses going? You think he's running something illegal? I think something doesn't add up, and I want a court order to inspect his entire property, not just the areas he shows inspectors. Judge Henderson initially denied the request, citing lack of probable cause, but David persisted, filing motion after motion, arguing that Roy's financial inconsistencies were directly relevant to establishing the filly's actual value and the legitimacy of his breeding operation. Finally, frustrated by David's persistence and curious about the discrepancies herself, the judge granted a limited inspection order. Roy fought it viciously, his lawyers filing emergency appeals and injunctions, which only made the judge more suspicious. The inspection was scheduled for Thursday morning. Sheriff Mills led a team that included a state agricultural inspector, a federal livestock agent who'd driven from Boise, and Doc Vance representing animal welfare concerns. Roy met them at his gate with his lawyers, his expression thunderous. "This is harassment," he snarled. "I've done nothing wrong." "Then you have nothing to hide," Sheriff Mills replied, though his tone suggested he didn't expect to find anything significant. They started with the main barn, the showcase facility Roy had showed inspectors for years. It was clean, well-maintained, horses healthy and properly housed. Nothing illegal, nothing suspicious. But the federal agent, a quiet man named Harrison, kept studying Roy's property map, comparing it to aerial photographs he'd brought. "What's this structure?" He pointed to a building set back from the main operation, partially hidden by trees. "Old storage barn," Roy said quickly. "Nothing of interest." "Mind if we look anyway?" Roy's jaw clenched. "That's outside the scope of your order. The order says full property inspection." Harrison was already walking toward the structure, and the others followed. What they found would haunt them all for years to come. The barn had been converted into an arena. Dirt floor freshly raked, walls reinforced. But it was the equipment that told the story. Weighted vests designed to build muscle through brutality. Treadmills rigged for excessive speed. medical supplies that suggested injuries were expected and frequent. And in the back pens, hidden from casual view, were more horses. Young ones, thin and scarred, watched the humans with eyes that had learned to expect pain. Harrison's face went wide. "This is a training facility for fighting." Doc Vance examined the horses with shaking hands, finding evidence of old wounds consistent with kicks and bites from other horses, scars that suggested violent encounters. One gelding had a partially healed gash across his chest that could only have come from another horse's teeth during combat. But it was what they found in Roy's office that broke the case wide open. A computer containing files Roy hadn't deleted thoroughly enough. Video footage of horses being forced to fight in makeshift arenas, financial records showing payments for entertainment events, names and numbers connecting Roy to an underground network spanning 3 states, and photographs, dozens of them, including several of the filly Jake had saved, showing her in weighted training vests, being conditioned for fights she was still too young to survive. Roy was arrested on the spot, his lawyers powerless to stop the federal charges that were filed within hours. Animal cruelty, operating an illegal fighting ring, racketeering. The list grew as investigators dug deeper, finding connections to other operations, other abusers, a network of cruelty that had operated in plain sight because no one had looked hard enough. The town of Crowley Springs went silent with shock, then erupted in chaos as people processed what had been happening in their community while they'd been arguing about property rights. The revelations about Roy's operation hit the town like a physical blow, the kind that leaves everyone stunned and reeling, unable to process the scope of what had been hiding in their midst. The local newspaper ran a front-page story with photographs from the raid, images that made people sick to their stomachs and ashamed of their blindness. Within 48 hours, the county prosecutor charged Roy Brennan with 23 counts of animal cruelty, illegal operation of a fighting ring, and racketeering. Federal authorities added charges related to interstate trafficking. His lawyers, suddenly less confident, began discussing plea agreements. The town's division collapsed under the weight of collective shame. Mayor Thompson held a press conference, his face haggard, admitting he'd been wrong to defend Roy's property rights without questioning what those rights were protecting. "I prioritized law over justice," he said, voice breaking slightly. "I defended a criminal because I couldn't see past legal technicalities to the suffering right in front of us." Sheriff Mills appeared beside him, looking older than his 50 years. "We received complaints about Roy Brennan for years, dismissed them as neighbor disputes or overreactions. We didn't want to see what was really happening because he had influence, because it was easier to look away. That failure is on me." Team Law crumbled as its members grappled with the knowledge they'd nearly helped return a filly to torture and death. Businesses that had boycotted Jake's supporters now quietly changed their positions. Social media posts defending Roy were hastily deleted, though screenshots had already immortalized them. But Team Justice didn't escape self-examination either. Anna Hartley called a meeting of supporters, gathering in the church basement where so much of the conflict had played out. "We were right about Roy," she said, "but we were also blind to the full extent of it. We suspected animal abuse, but we didn't see or didn't want to see that it went deeper than neglect. We settled for moral outrage without pushing for real investigation." Doc Vance stood beside her. "I treated injured horses from Roy's property twice over the years, accepted his explanations about accidents and bad luck. I knew better, felt something was wrong, but I didn't push hard enough because fighting with wealthy clients is bad for business." Her voice was harsh with self-recrimination. I failed those animals by choosing comfort over conviction. The community reckoning was painful and public, playing out in newspaper editorials, town halls, and living rooms across Crowley Springs. The divide that had seemed so clear, law versus justice, property rights versus moral obligation, revealed itself as false dichotomy. Both sides had failed in different ways, and both needed to change. Jake attended one of these community meetings, sitting in the back, uncomfortable with the attention but needing to witness the transformation his choice had catalyzed. Person after person stood to speak, many with tears streaming down their faces, confessing their complicity in defending Roy, apologizing for the harassment they'd directed at Jake and Rebecca. Then someone unexpected stood, a man Jake recognized as one of Roy's former employees, someone who'd publicly supported Team Law and called Jake a thief. "I knew," the man said, voice shaken. "I worked that property for 3 years and I knew something wasn't right. Saw things I told myself had innocent explanations. Heard things I pretended not to understand. And when Jake Sullivan did what I was too coward to do, I called him a criminal because facing his courage meant facing my cowardice." He looked directly at Jake. "I'm sorry, and I'm ashamed it took his sacrifice to make me find a spine." The applause was muted, weighed down by the heavy recognition that they were all complicit in different ways. The turning a blind eye to cruelty required active choice, not passive ignorance. Rebecca attended with Jake, and during a break several classmates approached her, led by a girl named Morgan, who'd been particularly vocal in her harassment. "I was awful to you," Morgan said without preamble. "Posted terrible things, got others to exclude you. I was defending my dad's position and didn't think about what your dad was actually trying to do. I'm sorry, really sorry." Rebecca's forgiveness came slowly, measured, but it came. "Thank you. That means something." As the investigation into Roy's operation expanded, more evidence emerged. Connections to other fighting rings across the Northwest. Video footage showing not just horse fighting but associated gambling operations. Financial records revealing Roy had been laundering money through his breeding operation for years, using the horses as both participants and cover for illegal enterprise. The federal prosecutor announced that Roy faced a minimum of 15 years in prison if convicted on all charges, possibly more given the scope of the operation and his refusal to cooperate with investigators. Roy's property was seized under asset forfeiture laws, the horses rescued and distributed to legitimate sanctuaries. The facility would be sold, proceeds going to victims' restitution and animal welfare organizations. And Hope, the filly whose suffering had started it all, was officially awarded to Jake Sullivan by court order. No one contested it. Roy's lawyers had bigger problems to handle, and the judge took grim satisfaction in the ruling. "Mr. Sullivan," Judge Henderson said when she signed the transfer papers, "you performed an act of conscience that revealed criminal enterprise and saved numerous animal lives. The court thanks you and apologizes for the burden this process placed on you." But it was the community's response that truly marked the change. The crowdfunding campaign for Jake's legal fees exceeded its goal, raising enough to cover not just the lawyers but the veterinary bills, and even make a dent in his overdue ranch payments. The feed store owner donated 3 months of supplies. Neighbors showed up unannounced to help repair his sagging fence lines. The bank, embarrassed by revelations they'd been among Roy's strongest supporters, quietly restructured Jake's loans under better terms. The gesture wasn't entirely altruistic. The PR of foreclosing on a local hero would have been disastrous, but Jake accepted it anyway. Rebecca's social life slowly rebuilt as classmates recognized the courage it took to stand with her father when the town was against him. She was invited to speak at a school assembly about moral courage, and though she was terrified, she did it, her voice shaken but clear. Doc Vance worked with the state veterinary board to establish new protocols for reporting suspected animal abuse, creating systems that made it harder for wealthy owners to evade oversight. Sheriff Mills reformed his department's approach to animal cruelty complaints, implementing mandatory follow-up investigations and removing the discretion that had allowed Roy's abuse to continue unchecked. The town passed an ordinance, the Sullivan Law they called it, that gave legal protection to individuals who rescued animals from immediate danger, establishing clear standards for when intervention was justified and protecting rescuers from civil liability. But perhaps the most significant change was internal, individual, the quiet transformation that happened when people stopped choosing comfort over conscience. It didn't happen overnight. There were still people who quietly believed Jake had overstepped, who thought property rights should have prevailed, who felt uncomfortable with how much their world had been upended. But they were quieter now, their certainty shaken, their arguments harder to defend aloud. The town hadn't become perfect. It had simply become aware of its capacity for complicity, and that awareness was worth something. 3 months after Roy's arrest, on a morning when spring was finally breaking winter's grip on the Idaho foothills, Jake stood in his pasture watching Hope graze among his small herd. She'd filled out, her coat glossy with health, her movements free of the pain and fear that had defined her those first terrible weeks. She wasn't fully healed, might never be. Some scars ran too deep. Some trauma carved permanent marks on a creature's psyche. But she was alive, safe, and beginning to trust that the world held kindness as well as cruelty. That was enough. That was everything. Rebecca joined him at the fence, resting her arms on the top rail in easy companionship. Their relationship had been tested by the town's division, strengthened by their choice to weather it together. College acceptance letter came, she said. Full scholarship to Montana State, animal science program. Jake's chest tightened with pride and bittersweet knowledge that she was growing up, growing beyond the small world of this struggling ranch. That's wonderful, sweetheart. Really wonderful. Think you'll manage without me? He looked at the pasture, the barn, the land that had nearly been lost but survived through community support and stubborn refusal to surrender. I'll manage. You go learn things I can't teach you, then maybe come back and make this place better than I ever could. That's the plan. They stood in comfortable silence, watching Hope investigate a patch of clover like it held the secrets of the universe. The simple pleasure of a horse doing horse things, unmarred by violence or exploitation. Doc Vance's truck appeared on the drive, arriving for a routine health check on the herd. She emerged with her medical bag and a smile that had become more frequent since Roy's arrest freed her from the complicity of treating animals she knew were being abused. "Morning, Jake, Rebecca." She approached the fence, eyes on Hope with the professional assessment that never quite shut off. "She's looking good, really good. Thanks to you. Thanks to you for not looking away when it would have been easier to." Doc Vance climbed through the fence rails with the ease of long practice, moving into the pasture to examine Hope more closely. The filly, who'd once flinched from every human touch, allowed the inspection with calm trust. "Got news," Doc Vance said as she checked Hope's healed wounds. State Veterinary Board wants you to join their advisory committee on animal welfare protocols. Think you'd have time?" Jake blinked, surprised. "I'm not a veterinarian. I'm just a rancher who saw what needed doing and did it despite the cost. That's exactly the perspective we need." Doc Vance finished her examination and gave Hope an approving pat. "We've got too many policies written by people who never got their hands dirty with actual animal care. Your voice would matter. I'll think about it. Good enough for now." As Doc Vance completed her rounds, other visitors began arriving. This had become routine over recent weeks. Neighbors and strangers showing up to see Hope, to hear her story, to witness what taking a stand looked like when it wore fur and walked on four legs. Anna Hartley came with a group of her students, part of a project about civic courage and moral decision-making. The teenagers asked thoughtful questions about how Jake decided to intervene, what kept him from giving up when the pressure mounted, how he balanced law against conscience. "There wasn't a moment of decision," Jake explained, leaning against the fence while Hope grazed nearby. "I saw her suffering and moved to stop it. Everything after was just dealing with consequences of that first simple choice. The hard part wasn't rescuing her. It was standing firm when people told me I was wrong to care more about her life than property law." One student asked, "Would you do it again, knowing how hard it got?" Jake didn't hesitate. "Every single time." The students scribbled notes, photographed Hope, and left talking animatedly about the assignment they'd write. Anna lingered, walking the fence line with Jake. "You've become a symbol," she said. "People across the state are talking about you, using your story to push for stronger animal protection laws. Don't feel much like a symbol. Feel like a guy who barely saved his ranch and got lucky that truth came out." "Luck played a part," Anna acknowledged, "but so did courage. Don't diminish what you did. This community needed to see that standing up was possible, that one person's choice could matter. You showed us that." As afternoon settled into evening, Jake sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun paint the foothills in gold and amber. Hope grazed peacefully. Rebecca studied at the kitchen table, and the ranch that had nearly been lost felt solid beneath him in ways that transcended property and money. He thought about the journey from that gray dawn when he'd found Hope tangled in wire to this quiet evening when she represented healing and hope, and the stubborn insistence that right mattered even when it cost everything. The town was changed. Maybe not transformed completely, but shifted, awakened to its own capacity for complicity and also its potential for redemption. The division that had seemed permanent had given way to something more complex, a community learning to question its assumptions, to prioritize conscience over comfort, to stand with the vulnerable even when it was inconvenient. Roy Brennan's trial was scheduled for next month, and though Jake dreaded the media attention it would bring, he was ready to testify. To speak for Hope and all the horses Roy had brutalized. To stand before a court and explain why property rights couldn't justify torture. Why looking away was itself a choice. Why rescue, even illegal rescue, was sometimes the only moral option. The phone rang, another reporter wanting an interview, but Jake let it go to voicemail. He'd said what needed saying. Now he just wanted to sit in the quiet of his saved ranch and watch a healed horse graze in peace. Rebecca joined him on the porch, bringing the coffee pot to refill his cup. "You okay, Dad?" "Yeah," Jake said, and meant it. "Yeah, I really am." The trial began on a Monday morning that dawned clear and cold. Jake arrived at the courthouse to find it surrounded by media trucks and protesters. some supporting stronger animal protection laws, others defending property rights and agricultural freedom from government overreach. The issues Hope had revealed were larger than one filly, larger than one town, touching fundamental questions about how society valued animal life versus human enterprise. Inside, the courtroom was packed. Roy sat at the defense table, looking diminished without his expensive cars and swagger, wearing an orange jumpsuit that reduced him to just another defendant facing justice. His legal team had tried for months to negotiate a plea, but Roy refused to admit guilt, clinging to the delusion that his money and connections would somehow save him. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They showed the video footage found on Roy's computer, horses fighting in makeshift arenas while men bet on the outcomes, animals screaming and bleeding while crowds cheered. They presented veterinary testimony about the injuries documented in rescued horses, the systematic brutality required to condition young horses for combat. Doc Vance testified, her voice steady despite the emotion behind it. She described finding Hope tangled in wire, the extent of her injuries, the evidence of long-term malnutrition and abuse that predated the wire wounds. She showed photographs that made jury members look away, images of scarred flanks and traumatized eyes. This filly was being prepared for fighting, Doc Vance explained. The weighted vests, the conditioning regimen visible in her muscle development, the scarring pattern consistent with previous violent encounters, all evidence of systematic preparation for combat she was too young to survive. Roy's lawyers tried to discredit her testimony, suggesting she was biased due to friendship with Jake, but her credentials and reputation withstood their attacks. She'd been treating animals in that valley for 40 years, had testified as expert witness in dozens of cases, had nothing to gain and much to risk by speaking against a wealthy community member. When Jake took the stand, he felt the weight of hundreds of eyes measuring him. The prosecutor, a stern woman named Carlson, led him through his testimony with practiced efficiency. "Tell us what you found that morning, Mr. Sullivan." Jake described the scene, the dawn light, the sound of distress, Hope tangled in wire with wounds that spoke of hours of struggling. He explained his decision to cut her free, to bring her to his ranch, to refuse return when Roy demanded his property back. "Why did you refuse?" Carlson asked. "Because I knew what he'd do to her. I'd heard the stories for years about Roy's treatment of animals, seen horses from his property come through the auction yard too thin and frightened. I knew sending her back meant sending her to more abuse. I couldn't do it, even though you knew it could cost you your ranch, your livelihood." Jake looked at the jury, at the faces of ordinary people trying to understand an extraordinary choice. "I've lost things before, money, property, comfort, but I've never lost myself by looking away when something needed doing. That filly's life mattered more than my financial security. It had to." Roy's defense attorney, a sharp-featured man named Winters, attempted to rattle him during cross-examination. "Mr. Sullivan, you claim moral authority, but you knowingly took property that wasn't yours, correct? I rescued an animal that was dying. Without legal authority, without following proper channels for reporting suspected abuse, you took the law into your own hands. I took a responsibility when no one else would. Isn't it true your ranch was facing foreclosure? That you had financial motive to keep a valuable animal rather than return it?" Jake's jaw tightened. Hope was never about money. She was about doing what's right when doing what's legal would have meant letting her die. The jury's expression suggested Winter's strategy was backfiring. that attacking Jake's motives only reinforced the moral clarity of his position. The prosecution's closing argument focused on the evidence, the video footage, the rescued horses, the financial records proving systematic criminal enterprise. But Prosecutor Carlson ended with hope. Members of the jury, among all the horses we rescued from Roy Brennan's property, one stands out. A filly found tangled in wire, left to die, who would have perished if Jake Sullivan hadn't made a choice that cost him nearly everything. That choice revealed what the defendant had hidden for years, that he wasn't a legitimate breeder, but a criminal running an animal-fighting operation. Some have argued this case is about property rights versus moral outrage. It's not. It's about whether we allow torture and exploitation to hide behind legal ownership, whether we punish those who shine light on darkness, whether a community chooses justice over comfort. The evidence is overwhelming. The verdict should be too. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. When they returned, Roy's face had gone gray, reading the outcome in their expressions before the foreman spoke. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted. Roy's family members cried. Animal welfare advocates cheered. The judge gavelled for order and set sentencing for 6 weeks out. Outside, Jake was swarmed by reporters asking for comment. He kept it brief. Justice was served. The horses Roy hurt are safe now, being cared for by people who value their lives over profit. That's all that matters. But one reporter pressed, "Do you regret how this divided your community?" Jake thought about the question, about the genuine pain the conflict had caused, the relationships damaged, the town's unity shattered. But he also thought about hope, about the horses rescued from Roy's property, about the laws being changed because people couldn't ignore what he'd uncovered. Regret? He shook his head. No. Unity built on looking away from cruelty isn't real unity. It's complicity dressed up as peace. Sometimes division is necessary to reach better ground on the other side. Sentencing came on a gray February morning. Judge Henderson entered the courtroom with an expression that suggested she'd spent considerable time preparing her remarks. Roy stood to hear his fate, his expensive lawyers flanking him, his family filling the front rows with tears and tissues. "Mr. Brennan," the judge began, "I've reviewed the evidence, the testimony, the scope of your criminal enterprise. What you perpetrated wasn't simple animal cruelty. It was systematic torture for profit, exploitation of creatures who couldn't speak for themselves, corruption that poisoned this community's ability to see truth right in front of them." She detailed the evidence methodically, the videos, the financial records, the testimony of former employees who'd finally found courage to speak. Then she delivered sentence. On the federal racketeering charges, 20 years. Animal cruelty charges across multiple counts, sentences to run consecutively, additional 15 years. Total sentence, 35 years in federal prison with possibility of parole after serving minimum of 25. Roy's knees buckled. His lawyers steadied him. His family members sobbed openly. At 63 years old, Roy Brennan would likely spend the rest of his life incarcerated. The judge wasn't finished. Additionally, you are permanently banned from owning, breeding, or working with animals of any kind. Your assets will be liquidated to pay restitution to animal welfare organizations and the victims of your enterprise. And, Mr. Brennan, she leaned forward slightly, I want you to understand something. This sentence isn't about revenge. It's about consequence. You built an empire on suffering, and that empire's collapse is justice finally catching up with cruelty you thought money could hide forever. As marshals led Roy away, his eyes found Jake in the gallery. The look wasn't apologetic or remorseful. It was hateful, bitter, filled with rage at being caught, at having his carefully constructed facade destroyed by a poor rancher who refused to look away. Jake held that gaze without flinching. He'd seen worse than Roy Brennan's hatred. He'd seen hope tangled in wire. That image would always be stronger than Roy's anger. Outside, the media circus resumed. Jake again kept his comments brief, uncomfortable with being cast as hero when he'd simply done what conscience demanded. But Rebecca surprised him by stepping up to the microphones. "My dad's being modest," she said, her voice carrying the nervous strength of someone forcing herself through fear. But what he did mattered. He saw something wrong and fixed it even when it cost him almost everything. That's not heroism. That's just being decent. And if more people were decent in that simple way, operations like Roy's couldn't exist. The clip went viral, Rebecca's earnest conviction resonating with people tired of corruption hiding behind legality, weary of systems that protected powerful predators over vulnerable victims. In the weeks following sentencing, the community continued its evolution. The Sullivan Law was adopted as model legislation in 3 other states. Animal welfare organizations used Hope's story in fundraising campaigns with Jake's reluctant permission. The farm that had been Roy's property was purchased by a nonprofit and converted into a legitimate rescue sanctuary, with Doc Vance serving as the veterinary director. But the most profound changes were quieter, personal. Sheriff Mills reformed his department's entire approach to complaint investigation, implementing systems that made it harder to dismiss reports simply because they involved influential community members. Mayor Thompson, humbled by his complicity, chose not to run for re-election, instead volunteering at the new sanctuary, doing physical labor that slowly rebuilt his moral authority through service rather than position. The church that had split during the conflict held a reconciliation service, bringing together team law and team justice for honest conversation about where both sides had failed. The healing wasn't instant or complete, but it was genuine, rooted in willingness to acknowledge mistakes rather than defend them. Anna Hartley integrated Hope's story into her curriculum, using it to teach critical thinking about when law and justice diverge, about moral courage, about standing for the vulnerable even when it's costly. Her students took field trips to visit Hope at Jake's ranch, seeing firsthand what their actions could protect. And Hope herself thrived. She was 3 years old now, no longer a filly but a young mare, her coat gleaming with health, her movements free of the pain and fear that had defined her early life. She'd never be completely without scars. Some trauma carved permanent marks. But she was happy, safe, valued for simply existing rather than for what exploitation could extract from her. Jake built her a new shelter, expanding his barn with donated materials and volunteer labor. On weekends, people showed up asking if they could help, wanting to contribute to the place that had sparked their community's transformation. He accepted, learning that receiving help with grace was its own kind of strength. One Saturday, as a group of volunteers installed new fencing, Tom Breslin approached Jake with quiet purpose. Tom was a cattleman who'd publicly supported Roy during the conflict, who'd called Jake a thief and worse, whose anger had been among the most vocal. "Jake," Tom said, hat in hands, "I've been meaning to talk to you, to apologize properly, not just in some public meeting where words are easy." Jake continued working on the fence post he was setting, giving Tom space to speak. "I was wrong," Tom continued, "about everything. About property rights mattering more than animal welfare. about you overstepping, about defending Roy because he was wealthy and connected, and I thought supporting him would matter to my business." His voice dropped. "I've raised cattle my whole life, love those animals, but I defended a man who tortured horses because I was too coward and too greedy to stand with what I knew was right. That shame's going to be with me a long time." Jake straightened, meeting Tom's eyes. "Then use it. Let it make you better, not just bitter. I'm trying. Started reporting every animal welfare concern I see, volunteering at the new sanctuary, speaking up when people make excuses for cruelty. It doesn't erase what I did, but maybe it builds towards something better. That's all any of us can do." They worked together the rest of the afternoon, the silence between them gradually shifting from awkward to companionable, demonstrating that redemption lived in actions more than words. As sunset painted the foothills in amber and gold, Jake stood alone in the pasture with Hope. She'd wandered over as the volunteers departed, seeking his company with the casual trust that still amazed him given where she'd started. "You changed everything," he told her, running his hand along her neck. "Didn't mean to, didn't plan to. Just existed and suffered and survived, and somehow that became a catalyst for transformation we all needed but couldn't create ourselves." Hope butted his shoulder gently, more interested in whether he'd brought treats than philosophical reflection. Jake smiled at the simple, beautiful normalcy of it. A horse being a horse, unburdened by a symbolism of meaning, just living in the uncomplicated present. Rebecca appeared at the fence, waving him toward the house. "Dinner's ready, and Doc Vance called. They want you to speak at the State Veterinary Conference next month." Jake sighed. More public speaking, more attention, more requests for his time and story. But if sharing Hope's journey helped prevent other animals from suffering what she'd endured, he'd do it. "Coming," he called back. Then to Hope, "You created a lot of work for me. You know that?" Her expression suggested she did not know and did not care. She was a horse. She wanted dinner. It was perfect. The State Veterinary Conference was held in Boise, drawing animal health professionals from across the Northwest. Jake had never been comfortable public speaking, but standing before 300 veterinarians, technicians, and animal welfare advocates, he found his voice by simply telling the truth. "I'm not a hero," he began, the microphone making his words fill the vast conference hall. "I'm a rancher who saw an animal suffering and couldn't walk away. What happened after, the town dividing, the legal battle, Roy's arrest, none of that was planned. It was just consequence of one simple choice." He described finding Hope, the immediate decision to help, the mounting pressure to return her, the moment he chose her life over his financial security. "People ask if I'd do it again knowing how hard it got. The answer's yes, but not because I'm brave. Because the alternative, leaving her to die because it was convenient or legal or safe, would have cost me something no money could replace. My integrity, my ability to look at myself without shame. That matters more than property or profit." When he finished, the applause was sustained and genuine. But it was the questions afterward that revealed how far Hope's impact had spread. A veterinarian from Oregon asked, "How do we balance professional ethics with financial reality? I've suspected abuse at facilities I work with, but confronting wealthy clients could destroy my practice." Jake understood the fear. "I can't tell you what to do with your career, but I can say that looking away has a cost, too, even if it's not as obvious as losing business. You've got to live with yourself. That's a longer burden than any financial hit." An animal control officer from Washington shared that Hope's story had inspired new protocols in her department. "We're no longer allowing wealth or influence to deter investigation. Your case showed us that sometimes the most powerful people are hiding the worst abuse." By the end of the conference, Jake had been approached by a dozen advocacy organizations wanting to partner on legislative initiatives, awareness campaigns, training programs for first responders who dealt with animal cruelty. He accepted what he could while being honest about his limitations. "I'm still a rancher with a small operation to run, but I'll help where I can, tell Hope's story when it serves the larger cause, stand with people fighting the fights I fought. Just understand, I'm not leading this movement, I'm just part of it." Returning to Crowley Springs felt like coming home to a place that had been transformed in his absence. The town that had divided over his decision to rescue Hope had found new unity in working toward systemic change. The sanctuary built on Roy's former property was thriving, housing 20 rescued horses with more expected. The local high school had established a scholarship in Rebecca's name for students pursuing animal science or veterinary medicine. The first recipient was Morgan, the girl who'd harassed Rebecca during the conflict and then apologized sincerely, now planning to become a large animal vet specializing in rescue cases. Rebecca herself was thriving at Montana State, sending weekly photos of the horses she worked with, the knowledge she was gaining, the future she was building. She planned to return to Crowley Springs after graduation, to work at the sanctuary and eventually take over Jake's ranch when he retired. "Assuming there's still a ranch to take over," Jake had joked during her last visit. "There will be," Rebecca replied with certainty, "because you built something that matters, Dad. Not just saved one horse, but started a movement that's protecting thousands. That's worth preserving." One evening, as spring settled into summer, Jake received an unexpected visitor. Judge Henderson appeared at his ranch, out of her robes and official capacity, just a woman in jeans and boots who wanted to see Hope for herself. "I hope this isn't inappropriate," she said, watching Hope graze with Jake's other horses. "But I needed to see her outside the courtroom context. Needed to understand what your choice protected beyond the legal abstractions." They walked the pasture together, the judge silent as she observed Hope's easy movement, her casual trust, her simple contentment. "During the trial, I struggled," Henderson admitted. "The law clearly favored Roy's property claim. You had no legal authority to take his horse, and precedent suggested I should order her return. But watching the evidence unfold, seeing what he'd done, understanding what returning her would have meant." She shook her head. "Some cases make you question whether law and justice are the same thing. What's your answer? They should be, but they're not always. And when they diverge, we need people brave enough or foolish enough to choose justice over legality." She looked at Jake directly. "You were that person. It shouldn't have been necessary. The system should have protected Hope before you had to break the law to save her. But since it didn't, I'm grateful you made the choice that mattered. Even though I violated property rights. Property rights exist to serve human society, not to protect torture. When they're used to shield cruelty, they become tools of oppression rather than justice. Roy forced a choice between law and morality. You chose correctly." After Henderson left, Jake sat on his porch, watching the sunset behind the foothills, turning the sky brilliant shades of orange and red and gold. The ranch that had nearly been lost now felt solid in ways that transcended ownership and debt. This was home. earned through sacrifice and moral courage, defended by community that had learned to see beyond comfort to conscience. Hope grazed peacefully, the scars that marred her coat visible but no longer defining. She was 3 years of healing embodied in muscle and bone, proof that trauma could be survived, that kindness could overcome cruelty, that one person's refusal to accept evil as inevitable could catalyze transformation beyond imagining. Rebecca called that evening, excited about a class she'd taken on animal trauma recovery. "We studied Hope's case, Dad. My professor used her as example of successful rehabilitation, said her recovery shows what's possible with proper care and commitment. I told the class she was ours. What did they say?" They applauded, and then they asked 1,000 questions about her daily routine, her behavior changes, her relationship with the herd. I felt so proud, Dad. Proud of her, proud of you, proud to be part of her story. We didn't do anything special, sweetheart, just refused to look away. That is special. That's everything. After the call, Jake walked back to the pasture one last time before bed. Hope approached the fence, expecting treats, receiving instead just his hand on her neck and quiet words she couldn't understand but seemed to appreciate anyway. "You saved me as much as I saved you," he told her. "Gave me a purpose beyond survival. Showed me that standing for something matters even when it costs everything. Thank you for that." Hope's response was to search his pockets for carrots. Finding none, she returned to grazing, unbothered by sentiment or philosophy. She was a horse. She wanted grass and safety and the simple comfort of a herd. Jake gave her all of that and counted himself fortunate to be able to do so. 2 years after Roy's sentencing, Crowley Springs held its first annual Hope Festival, a celebration of animal welfare, community healing, and the transformative power of moral courage. The event drew thousands from across the state, vendors selling everything from rescue organization merchandise to local crafts, educational booths teaching about animal rights and welfare, and a parade featuring horses rescued from various abuse situations, now thriving in legitimate sanctuaries. Hope was the guest of honor, standing in Jake's pasture while visitors lined the fence to see her, to photograph her, to understand what she represented. Jake stayed with her, uncomfortable with the celebrity but accepting it as price for raising awareness. A young girl, maybe 8 years old, approached the fence timidly. "Is that her? Is that really Hope?" "That's her," Jake confirmed. "My mom says you saved her, that you're a hero." Jake knelt to the girl's eye level. "I'm not a hero. I just saw something that needed doing and did it. You could do the same thing if you saw an animal in trouble. But wouldn't I get in trouble for taking someone else's property?" It was a fair question, one Jake had thought about often. Maybe, probably. But some things are more important than staying out of trouble. If you see a creature suffering, and you have power to stop that suffering, you've got a choice to make. Sometimes the brave choice costs something. You've got to decide if you're willing to pay that cost. The girl thought about this solemnly. "I think I would be. If it meant saving someone like Hope, then you'll do fine in this world." As the festival continued, Jake participated in a panel discussion about the Sullivan Law and its implementation across multiple states. He was joined by Doc Vance, Sheriff Mills, and representatives from animal welfare organizations who'd used Hope's story to push for legislative change. "The law's not perfect," Jake admitted during the discussion. "But it's better than what we had before. It protects people who intervene in good faith to stop immediate animal suffering, provides clear standards for when rescue is justified, and creates accountability for owners who abuse animals. That's progress. Sheriff Mills added, "From law enforcement perspective, it gives us tools we didn't have. Before, people who reported abuse often saw nothing happen because wealthy owners had lawyers and influence. Now, we're required to investigate every report thoroughly, with oversight that makes dismissing complaints harder. It's changed the culture in our department and our community." An audience member asked, "But doesn't this law threaten legitimate animal operations? Don't farmers and ranchers worry about false accusations?" Doc Vance responded, "The law has safeguards. It requires objective evidence of immediate danger and medical documentation of the animal's condition. It's not about punishing accidents or normal farming practices. It's about addressing systematic abuse. Legitimate operations have nothing to fear because they're not torturing animals." The discussion ranged across topics: implementation challenges, resistance from agricultural lobbies, success stories from other states. But it returned consistently to hope, to the specific case that had made abstract principle concrete and undeniable. As the festival wound down and crowds dispersed, Jake led Hope through a demonstration of her recovery, showing how she responded to commands, how she interacted with other horses, how she'd been trained for therapeutic riding programs that helped children with disabilities. "This is what Roy's torture was preparing her for," he explained to the remaining audience. "Fighting, violence, exploitation. Instead, she's bringing joy and healing to kids who need it. That transformation is what this fight is about, ensuring animals can fulfill their potential as companions and healers rather than being broken for profit." That evening, after the last visitor had left and the festival grounds were being cleaned, Jake sat on his porch with Rebecca, who'd come home for the event. They watched Hope graze peacefully, the setting sun painting her coat golden. "You ever think about what would have happened if you'd walked away that morning?" Rebecca asked. Jake had thought about it often. She'd have died. Roy would have continued his operation. The town would have continued pretending everything was fine. We'd all be complicit in cruelty we chose not to see. And now? Now Roy's in prison. 30 horses were rescued from his property. Laws changed in 4 states. Community learned to choose conscience over comfort. He paused. And one horse who was supposed to die in wire or a fighting ring gets to spend her days grazing peacefully and teaching kids about trust and healing. That's worth every hard moment. Rebecca leaned her head against his shoulder. "I'm proud to be your daughter. Proud that when it mattered, you chose right over easy. I'm proud you stood with me when I made that choice. Took courage I didn't have at your age." They sat in comfortable silence as stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. The ranch that had nearly been lost was thriving now, sustained by speaking fees from Jake's advocacy work, donations from people inspired by Hope's story, and the simple satisfaction of knowing they'd built something that mattered beyond profit or property. Inside the house, Jake's phone buzzed with messages from people across the country, some sharing their own rescue stories, others asking advice about situations they weren't sure how to handle. Still others simply saying thank you for showing them that standing up was possible. He responded when he could, offering encouragement and practical guidance, but knowing each person ultimately had to make their own choice about whether conscience mattered more than convenience. Doc Vance stopped by before heading home from the festival. "Hell of a day," she said, settling into a porch chair. "Hell of a 2 years." "Agreed." You know the sanctuary's operating at capacity now. 20 horses, all rescues, all thriving. We've got applications from 3 more states wanting to place rescued animals with us. That's wonderful. It's exhausting, Doc Vance corrected with a tired smile. But it's good exhausting, the kind that comes from work that matters. She looked at Hope. She started it all, one filly and wire, one choice to help, and suddenly we're operating a multi-state rescue network with legislative victories and cultural transformation. It's remarkable. It's overwhelming, Jake admitted. Sometimes I just want to be a rancher again. Take care of my animals without cameras and microphones and people looking to me for answers I don't have. Then do that. You've earned the right to step back, let others carry the fight forward. But Jake knew he couldn't. Having seen what was possible when people refused to accept cruelty as inevitable, he was compelled to keep pushing, keep advocating, keep telling Hope's story until it became too common to be remarkable. Until every community had people willing to stand for the vulnerable regardless of cost. As midnight approached and Rebecca went inside to bed, Jake took one last walk to the pasture. Hope was lying down, resting peacefully among the herd, her breathing steady and calm. The scars that marked her coat were visible even in moonlight, reminders of where she'd been and what she'd survived. But they didn't define her anymore. She was defined now by the peace she'd found, the healing she'd achieved, the lives she'd touched through simply existing as proof that trauma could be overcome and cruelty could be defeated. Jake knelt in the grass beside her, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "You did good, girl," he whispered. "You survived. You healed. You changed everything just by refusing to give up. That's more than most of us manage in a lifetime." Hope's ear flicked toward his voice, acknowledging his presence without opening her eyes. She was safe. She was home. She was loved. That was everything. Jake stood slowly, his joints protesting after a long day, and walked back toward the house where light still glowed warm against the darkness. His ranch, his home. The place where he'd made a choice that cost him nearly everything and gained him more than money could measure. The town of Crowley Springs slept around him, transformed by the division that had nearly broken it, stronger now for having confronted its complicity and chosen change over comfort. Not perfect, never perfect, but better. Actively, intentionally better. And at the heart of it all, a horse grazed peacefully in moonlight, unburdened by symbolism or significance, simply living the life she'd almost been denied. Hope, in every sense of the word.